Hello, I'm Pat Collins. Welcome to Criminal Justice Matters. An internet search of the term genocide will unearth mentions of such names as Bosnia, Darfur, Rwanda, and the Holocaust, but no mention of Latin America. Yet there's evidence of genocide taking place in Latin America, especially during and in the wake of the Cold War. So why the silence? A cover-up? A conspiracy? And if so, what are the reasons that this story is just beginning to be told? State violence and genocide in Latin America is our topic, and also the title of a book from Routledge Publishers and edited by our guest, Marcia Esparza, an assistant professor of criminal justice here at John Jay. Also joining us is Patrice McSherry, who's professor of political science at Long Island University and founding chair and director of its Latin American Studies program. And welcome to the program. And as we get started, I'd like to know obviously about genocide and violence in Latin America, but how did things get this way? How did this pattern, what seems to be a pattern, get started?
Mm-hmm. Well, in Latin America, if we focus on this particular region in the world, and as I stated very clearly in the introduction to my book, to our book, Latin America hasn't been approached from a genocidal perspective. And that one of the reasons why is that for this omission of or silence on the topic of state crimes in the region has been that the United Nations Convention on Genocide protects victims who are categorized based on their ethnicity, race, religion, or nationality, not on politics. And the victims in Latin America during the Cold War years, that's the focus of our book, were political victims. And therefore, scholars of genocide in Europe and in the United States have been a little bit reluctant to approach the subject matter from that perspective. And I think that has grave consequences in many areas.
But the whole issue of genocide and political violence comes out of a history, and I'm not the historian here by any means, but comes out of a history of upheavals and dictatorships and military coups. Is that correct? And if so, why?
Well, you know, what I would argue is that even though there were examples of military coups in a number of countries, there were others that did develop in a democratic way, including Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica. And so sometimes people have the perception that the whole region has a culture of violence.
Sure.
Yeah, but it's not really, I don't think, accurate. And what we are trying to show in our book and in other work that we have both done is that the patterns of violence changed during the Cold War. So how do you understand that? Essentially, I think you have to understand a kind of regional perspective in which the United States also played a role in terms of the whole anti-communist mentality, the fear of revolution, the fear of another Cuba in the region, so that a whole kind of counterinsurgency regime was developed in the region with a lot of resources from the United States. So you began to see militaries carrying out mass violence in new kinds of ways.
Are you saying that was happening at the behest of, and maybe rather quietly, and I don't mean secretly, I mean in a rather subtle way, that it was caused by the U.S. government, caused by the relationship of the United States and the way it treats Latin America or has treated Latin America?
Well, the United States was very worried about kind of its backyard becoming a more revolutionary or even a more nationalist or progressive kind of region.
Is that about economics or politics?
Both, both, you know. Because the U.S. does have economic interests, but also political interests, geopolitical interests in Latin America. And Cuba was something that very much was a catalyst for a lot of really paranoia in Washington, but also among the militaries.
As in, look what happened there, let's not have it happen elsewhere.
And so there's a lot of evidence of the United States training the militaries to really change their mission from external defense to internal security. In other words, the people of your country are the enemy, the internal enemy. And this is kind of known as the national security doctrine. And not only was the doctrine very prevalent throughout the region, but the U.S. expended a lot of resources to train the militaries, to finance intelligence organizations, and to back military coups in these countries. Washington was often behind that.
What changed during the Cold War years was this mentality that there was an internal enemy. The enemy was not outside of the borders of each of these countries in Latin America, rather the enemy was inside. But who were the enemies? Who were these groups that were then targeted for violence? They were the workers, trade unions, the lower classes. And when you talk about and when you begin to examine who the victims were, you then find a pattern throughout the history of Latin America. So yes, we focus on the Cold War, but in order to understand the Cold War era in Latin America, you need to go back to the Monroe Doctrine, the Manifest Destiny, in which the United States said, you know, Latin America belongs to the Americans, and we don't want any interference, and the resources will be ours, and we will control this, their political systems. And then you have, I mean, numerous examples of dictatorships that have been backed up by the United States. Trujillo, 30 years. I mean, the Caribbean is just, you know, a whole area.
Were they backed up for political reasons and economic reasons, or were various dictatorships supported because the alternative was even worse?
Well, you know, you could look at a case like Chile, which we could talk about. Salvador Allende, right? He was a socialist, a Marxist.
There are a lot of non-historians watching us, including your host. So give us some dates around this to give us some perspective.
He was elected
not precise dates, but you know, if you can get close to it.
Well, you know, as I said, he was a Marxist who had run for president in the 60s, but was never the victor. But he did win in 1970, and the United States government, particularly Nixon and Kissinger, were extremely hostile to Allende, even though he was elected.
What are they, for another Fidel Castro?
Yes, but you know, they wanted to keep Latin America within the orbit of the United States. Remember, this is the Cold War. There was a lot of fear of new progressive movements or, you know, kind of anti-U.S. movements. And even in cases where people were elected, you know, we're not only talking about guerrilla organizations, we're talking about people elected for posts. The United States went in and tried to subvert the government of Allende. In fact, they tried to prevent him from being elected in the first place. They tried to undermine his victory. They tried to foment a military coup, which then finally did happen in 1973.
But in all this, the people, you said, one of you said something really poignant before, and maybe you both said it, but that the people became the enemy.
Surely. I mean, those who were organized for political reasons, which is so intertwined with economics, right? And so you had from the 50s and 60s and 70s in these countries throughout Latin America, Central America and South America, massive social movements, grassroots organization, people organizing in towns, in small villages, in the urban, rural areas. It was massive organization. In Central America, a religious factor has to be considered, the theology of liberation. The theology of liberation, which said that the Catholic Church had to bring awareness of people's inequalities, and that had tremendous implications for peoples in the countryside, particularly indigenous peoples in Guatemala, the Mayans, but also in South America. So all this movement from below had to be crashed down and eliminated for good. It wasn't just torture for let's silence them for a little bit. It was.
But this is where genocide comes into the picture.
Yes. Yes. That's why it's different when we analyze the Cold War. It wasn't just torture to quiet down people. It was to eliminate groups of people.
In looking at in doing research for this and other programs, I get to talk a lot about legal issues and courts and various structures. And one phrase that I didn't come across before was something called truth commissions. What are truth commissions?
Well, truth commissions are ad hoc commissions of, that interrogate the past, usually sponsored by the United Nations. In Latin America, we have had, most countries have had official and unofficial truth commission. By I mean official are those
sanctioned
that
by
are
the UN.
By the UN in collaboration with the states. So you have a, kind of, we have to be very careful with truth commissions because right now, I believe from my perspective, there's a little bit of misunderstanding about truth commissions. The idea is, that most people I think have, is that truth commissions actually bring some sort of justice. No.
Well, the very name, from my perspective, says, I hope these people come up with something good because whatever the outcome they come out with, it's going to be known as the truth. After all, the Truth Commission came up with it. And is that a problem or a good perspective?
I have to be very careful because every time I raise a criticism against, about truth commissions, I get, these really weird looks because it's something that truth commissions are great in terms of recording.
They're out to do a good thing.
Totally, because they record the experiences of the victims. And in that regard, they are able to recover the historical memory from the victim's perspective. My criticism to truth commissions today is that they don't do a very good job in terms of recovering the historical memory of the perpetrators. Why is that the guy that, and we have this really excellent movie about Argentina, the official story, where the guy gets up in the morning, kisses his wife goodbye, the two children, lovely father, and then 2 hours later he's torturing. I mean, how do you account for that? And that's what happened in our countries in Latin America.
Yeah, could I add one thing, which is that what was really, I talked before about new patterns of violence during the Cold War. What was really widespread was illegal violence. In other words, disappearances, torture, extrajudicial execution, assassination. These are the ways that these so-called internal enemy were combated by the militaries. And so a lot of families never found out what happened to their family members. They still have no idea. The military always defended its acts as in the name of the nation, in the name of the country, et cetera. And so really it's truth commissions try to present what really happened and overcome this kind of barrage of military propaganda about what happened.
But doesn't a body such as, or can a body such as a Truth Commission undermine the legal structure or subvert the legal system of the country in which it's operating?
The thing is, the military had already done that. The justice
Okay.
system was non-functional. I mean, the justice systems in most of the countries had been bypassed or shut down
or collaborated
with the militaries. In other words, basically, there was a real need to find out what had happened, and these truth commissions took different forms in different countries. But it's not the same as justice either.
Tell me about the case of Tucapel Jimenez, if you will.
Tucapel Jimenez was a trade union leader that at the time of his assassination...
In what country?
In Chile, I'm sorry. At the time of his assassination in 1982 in Santiago, Chile, he was organizing, he was being very successful at pulling together different trade union organizations.
Now, what's poignant here, and I don't think that you mentioned it, is he was not a major political figure, he was a cab driver.
No, he was actually, Tucapel Jimenez was a major figure in politics.
But a labor organizer?
A labor organizer, and what was he doing at that point when he was killed during the Pinochet year by the intelligence apparatus from the Pinochet regime, was that he was galvanizing a lot of support that to protest the dictatorship. He was working part-time, a lot of people do that in Chile, as a cab driver, and that's when they got an opportunity.
I'm not knocking the occupation there, but what I assume by that is that he was an important figure in organized labor, which is, one could be a cab driver and be a very important figure.
Totally. Well, the important thing with the Tucapel Jimenez is it took over 20 years to bring the case to some sort of a trial. And the trial went from, was stalled for, I think, 17 years at the hands of one judge. So that tells you the obstacles that we still face in some of these countries in terms of bringing justice. So finally, the case was, there was a sentence. And the officer who killed not life in prison, but at least 20 years.
But
or
it
something
took
like that.
20 years to have the case come about.
But this is a paradigmatic case. This is a case, emblematic case that has been brought to justice because he was a well-known leader. Otherwise, most cases have not been brought to justice in Chile.
What's the status now? You mentioned before that the military in Latin American countries becomes a defender or an internal defender of the country.
Against internal enemies, do you mean?
Against,
yeah, they
where
had an
do they
internal
stand now?
security
Because you said some things in your research about the military, about their the culture of obedience, the culture of secrecy that they need to function. But that's an important part of, and military discipline's an important part of a successful military.
Yeah. The thing was that during the Cold War, the military has completely escaped civilian control. Okay? They overthrew the civilians. They replaced the civilians in government.
I agree. We actually agree it's a problem.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And so, we're not just talking about the internal dynamics of the military, but the way they took over countries and repressed all opposition. They eliminated political parties. They shut down constitutional rights. In other words, it was a repressive system that affected everyone in the society.
We'll talk. I thought for a moment I was reading something like a spy novel or a Robert Ludlum book when I came across something called Operation Condor, which actually was a title you might know of a Jackie Chan film.
Yes,
so it has
yes.
It has other overtones, but what is the actual Operation Condor?
Well, Operation Condor was essentially a secret component of the repression. It had a very specific function. It was created by the military regimes with backing by the United States. But it essentially was a cross-border death squad. In other words, people who had fled their own countries to escape the repression could be targeted, abducted, tortured, and killed in Allied territories. So it was an agreement among the military regimes to carry out operations, joint operations to target their own exiles. And people were targeted even in the United States. There was a very famous assassination here in Washington, D.C. in 1976. Former Chilean Foreign Minister Orlando Letelier died in a car bombing along with his U.S. co-worker. And that case was a case of Operation Condor. It carried out assassinations around the world.
Give me a time frame on this, and is it still out there?
No.
Do we know?
Essentially, it was formed in around late 73 or early 74. As I said, it was mainly a cross-border kind of operation, and it seems to have closed down by about 83. Although there's a couple of cases in the early 90s that seem to use the framework of Condor in terms of people disappearing in one country and then reappearing dead in another country.
I don't want to raise all sorts of, you're going to say something.
Yeah, but I think it's important also to point out that in the case of Condor, the U.S. also had a,
It did have a very important role behind the scenes.
I will put you on the spot a bit. If this is such a secret organization, I don't want to create
How do we
more
know
paranoia.
about it?
How do you know it? It's gone in 1982 or
Well, it's
93.
hard to tell. I mean,
Right.
I've been doing research on it for about a dozen years. And up until the late 90s, we had very little documentary information. We just had testimonies from survivors of Condor. A couple of military officers had also spoken about it. But the first files that were discovered were in Paraguay in 1992, which did give some evidence of Condor. And then under Bill Clinton, when Pinochet was arrested by Judge Garzón in 1998, he asked Clinton whether there was any information that could help with the case. And so under Clinton, a number of files were declassified here. Those are actually available online. I've spent numerous hours researching those files.
I wanted to ask both of you, how do you track the accuracy of the evidence of the what amount to war stories? I'd imagine with all the horror, with all the violence, with all the genocide, there are also people who might like to embellish for their own purposes their experience. How do you filter through
You have to really triangulate. I mean, this is what I've learned in research. You have to compare testimonies with documents, with second sources, third sources. In other words, you really have to double check and triple check to establish a story.
But I also think that it's important to note, and this goes back to your question about the role played by truth commissions in accounting for past atrocities. And I have to say that this issue of giving validity and legitimacy to the testimony is a work that has been done primarily by Jewish, the Holocaust scholars. They are the ones that, Latin America has been, as we have mentioned here, studied, very little, but Holocaust scholars have looked at the testimony and have looked at the validity of the testimony. So we are really building upon a body of literature that comes out of this, of the Holocaust, in terms of how do we know how many people died in a given massacre, if the military came from the northern part of the village or the southern, how do you account for all that? It's a very interesting question, actually.
In doing your research, I'd imagine you have certain expectations of what you'll find, that you develop a hypothesis or a germ of an idea and go after it and try to see if it's valid. In doing your research, what surprised you? What did you learn that you didn't expect?
Well, actually, in my work with the Truth Commission, I work with for the Truth Commission in Guatemala, the UN Truth Commission, and after a year of interviewing war survivors, I thought I had figured out pretty much everything I needed to know. But then after the Truth Commission was over, I went back to a small town where I had taken testimonies to find out why certain communities, certain areas of the town didn't come forward to testify to the Truth Commission. Why some communities came forward, some people, organizations came forward to testify to the Truth Commission because this testifying is voluntary, and not others. And what I found out is that half of the town was still controlled by paramilitary forces. So that's why people didn't come forward to testify until their war stories.
I want to, in the couple of minutes we have remaining, I want to come back to where we stand today. What areas of Latin America are the most problematical, and what are the success stories?
I have a few things to say about that. First of all, I think we in the United States can learn a lot from Latin Americans because, as a matter of fact, since 1998, there have been a number of court cases where justice is starting to occur in a number of countries. And in fact, just to be clear, the violence of the military is over. I mean, that part is over, except in Colombia.
Legal systems are starting to work.
Yeah, they are. There were transitions to kind of weak democracies in the 80s, and since then, in each country, there's a different process, and it took a long time to overcome the fear, and also the militaries, in some cases, tended to retain important political power. But that's been changing. That's been changing over time. And as I said, now there are a number of court cases where, for example, in Argentina and Uruguay, and I think in Chile as well, there have been some trials of notorious human rights abusers.
And in Peru with Fujimori.
And in Peru with Fujimori. He was recently convicted, as a matter of fact, for running a death squad during the 90s. But, for example, just a couple of weeks ago in Uruguay, there were 8 people convicted, 8 officers convicted of human rights crimes, and they were notorious Condor operatives. In other words, everybody knew who they were. They were known for torture. People had identified them, and yet for 20 years they were living freely. But now there's been this historic court case, and they've been convicted.
So we started out talking about violence and genocide, but evidently the picture is one that's kind of hopeful.
Yes,
I think so.
I think so. I think it's slow. I would like to see more cases being brought to trial.
Right. But the legal systems are in place so that can happen.
I mean, I think it's hope in the legal system.
One thing that's always in place, unfortunately, around here is the clock, and I'm afraid we're out of time.
Okay.
So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you
Very much for watching. I'm Pat Collins, and I'll see you on the next edition.